Well, if you missed last week, we started a conversation, I would say, about rest. You need to go back and watch that sermon that says, Enter God's Rest, because that is the theological background behind the sermon that I'm about to preach, connecting the word Sabbath, that we would make every effort to enter into God's rest. So the title for the sermon is Sabbath, Make Every Effort. Make every effort. The word Sabbath is the Hebrew word for Shabbat, which means to stop, quite literally. And honestly, up until a few years ago, I thought that Sabbath was primarily meant for Jewish people. And the only context that I had for Sabbath at all was that Chick-fil-A closed on Sundays, and God seemed to bless them. That was about it, with heavenly chicken and then a lot of money. So it made sense to me that Sabbath, like that was kind of it. Or I grew up in a church tradition where it felt like all of Sabbath was just make sure you attend church and then master the post-church nap. Some of y'all know what I'm talking about. You're really good at it, where you wake up and you're like in another dimension after church. Like, that's my whole entire context related to Sabbath. And what I realized is that so much of my backing in the church was what I would call all about orthodoxy, which is good. All of Paul's letters start with orthodoxy. But when it came to orthopraxy, to making every effort to practice the ways of Jesus, I found in my life that I was severely lacking. And I found in my life that typically speaking, most of the orthodox thoughts that I had meant that theoretically, if I was a Christian, what that meant is that I would one day pass a cosmic quiz about doctrine in heaven and I'd be good. Like my whole thought process was all about that. When in actuality, if you read the early church and you read the New Testament, what you see really early on is that they were followers of the way, meaning a way of life. So here at this church, we talk about a radical discipleship that we're inviting you into. And most of the time, what that looks like is so much more about a way of life. We call it a cultural tide. That when you come to this church, you will notice that there are certain things that are different. There's distinctions. There's something about the way of life that you're invited into, and our hope is that you be swept up by that tide. Let me give you an example. In Auburn, Alabama, the worst time for traffic the last month was at 5:55 a.m. on Glen Avenue because so many people wanted to pray. That's a cultural tide. Or you being willing to drive back on a Saturday from your vacation or from the lake just to be in the room for church on Sunday. Or when you join a community group, we will not settle for you consuming a Bible study or just sitting back and playing it safe. No, we want to make sure you're not a jerk to your kids. Or think about fathers. At the end of this gathering, there will be a communion moment. And it's super uncomfortable for a lot of people in the room because we ask fathers to pray over their wives out loud and fathers to pray over their families. Because we believe at this church that the father should take back the role as the spiritual discipler of their children and lead their family. And it will be awkward and it's uncomfortable, but I will say it every single week. Fathers, pray over your kids. And I think a lot of us immediately think it means worship. And I see you Baptists, you finally got to hear, okay? It's a big deal, you're expressive in worship. And some of you Presbyterians, you've gone from this to this, and heaven might come down. We never know, I've seen the change in some people as you encounter God's presence in this moment, but I just wanted to offer up a new cultural tide that's kind of a remnant, and it's this tide of Sabbath. That for 24 hours, every single week, you would set aside time to rest and pause in the presence of God. And I stand before you quite honestly as somebody who did not do this most of my life and has not mastered it by any means. I read John Mark Comer, Ruthless Elimination of Hurry a few years ago, and I got involved in practicing the way, and I started noticing that there was a way of life that was different than the one that I was living, and I started to ask some questions that have led me to stand in front of you today with a dream and a conviction. What if the people who call this church home make every effort to enter into heavenly rest? What if the way we reach our cities is not from more willpower, but by adopting his way and adopting the way of rest that launches us into the weeks ahead? So we're going to go back to the scriptures, Hebrews chapter 4. We're going to skip down to verse 4. And it says this, "For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words. On the seventh day, God rested from all his works." And again, in the passage above, he says, "They shall never enter my rest." So again, go back and listen to last week. He's quoting Psalm 95. where he says, somewhere it says, I love that. The writer of Hebrews is like, somewhere it says, I don't know, Genesis, the beginning of the Bible. And Genesis 2 says this, thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had begun doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. That word in Hebrew for rest is menuha. It's more of a joyous response. It's a delight that the work has been finished. And then verse 3, it says, then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Now, this is so important, because does God need to rest? The answer is no. He's all-powerful. He's almighty. He does not need to rest. So then why does he choose to rest? Well, number one, I think he wants to delight in the work that he has done. But also, number two, could it be that God made us in his image and knew that we would go down this downward spiral of producing and manufacturing and creating and trying to be God instead of obey God? Could it be that as we are made in his image, we all of a sudden want to adopt the practices of being him instead of allowing him to be him? And what I mean by that is I think for us, it's so easy to jump into the excuse of whatever you have going on to not enter into the rest. But then you have this fact, God rested. So, but I have toddlers, and you have no idea how hard it is to rest. God rested. Yeah, but I'm starting a company. I'm starting a new, yeah, but God rested. Yeah, but you don't understand my situation. God rested. And it makes sense because after Genesis 2 is Genesis 3. Yep, what happens in Genesis 3? Genesis 3, people, Adam, Eve, they receive a lie. You will be like God. And they believe the lie and they eat of the fruit. And what happens? It says this in chapter 3, verse 17. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It needs to be said, work is good. We were created to rule and reign. But here, it shows us what has happened from the beginning of Genesis all the way up until present day, is that there will be a painful toil in our working, which means sometimes what is good, work, can become our God. That's what's being said here. Let me put it this way. If you're an alcoholic, we will send you to rehab. If you're a workaholic, you probably got a bonus this year. And we're celebrated. And I say that out of guilt in my own life. You know, I used to say all the time, I'm so busy. And I would say, I'm busy. This season is busy. Everything's busy right now. I'm just so busy with everything going on. And I would act like I hated it, but secretly, I loved it. And the reason why I knew something was wrong in me connected to my work was the moment that when I started to rest, it felt like laziness. It felt like sloth. In fact, I would say that rest began to feel like sin because work had become my idol. Rest felt like sin because work had become my idol. And I got to this very dangerous place of being so okay with being busy without God rather than bored with God. I was focused on my activity and my work rather than entering into the rest that's available for me through awe and wonder in the presence of God. And there was a breaking point for me. Everybody has a breaking point at some point. And I'll never forget, it was a Sunday after an amazing day. And Miles had given our entire staff the morning off. So I wake up and I'm like, great, I have some time to rest. So I'm gonna go on a run. And there's a trail outside, and I know it's kind of ironic. She laughed in the front row. Yeah, it's kind of ironic. I'm like, I'm gonna rest by going on a run. So I go on a run, and on this run, I kid you not, I'm listening. I look down at my Nike Run app. I'm like, well, I gotta keep the right pace, you know? I don't want everybody to think I'm slow now all of a sudden. So I'm kind of picking up my pace faster and faster, and I'm listening to a sermon in my ears, and I'm like, looking at the time, like, you know what? I'm not gonna finish this sermon if I keep listening at this pace. So I bump up the sermon to 2 times speed, and I'm literally sprinting, trying to keep up this pace while I'm overstimulating my ears with this sermon, and I'm running down this trail, and I pass this elderly couple, and they're like walking this way with me, and I pass them, I'm running all the way down to the end of the trail, and I turn around, I'm running all the way back, and I see the same elderly couple, and I just stop, because they'd made it like 15 feet. I'd run all the way to the end of the trail and back, and this time they were smiling at me, and the wife was holding a flower. And so I literally stop, and I say hello, and I'm walking, and it just hits me. Like, I'm literally sprinting, it's a symbol of my life. I'm literally sprinting myself into anxiety. And I laugh out loud because I look down and the sermon I'm listening to is about rest. And I had this moment where I realized, man, so many of us are living the exact life that I'm describing, where we're trying to flood ourselves with content and we're trying to beat some sort of imaginary goal and we're trying to achieve all these things in God's name. And I realized the deeper insight that I think is really relevant for some of you in this room, especially if you grew up in competitive environments. The deeper insight is this. I realized it was so hard for me to enter into God's rest because I viewed God as this sort of cosmic coach. Like he's behind me, like, keep going, Gage. Keep running. Keep creating. Keep doing. And I feel like he's behind me, and it's a good thing. It's like, yes, I want my life to matter. I want my life to count. But when I saw that woman holding that flower, it hit me. Maybe God wants to be a relational father. And he wants to take me on a leisurely stroll so I can admire the flowers he created. And I've been viewing God as this cosmic coach. Keep going, keep running, keep doing. When in fact, he might just be a relational father. You know, one of my life verses is Hebrews 12, which we're going to get there later. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses, including Chad Wilbanks now, let us throw off everything that hinders us. Let us throw off the sin that entangles us. Let us run the race marked out before us with perseverance, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who by the joy set before him endured the cross and scorned it. Like, I love that verse. The only problem is we're in Hebrews 4. That's Hebrews 12. Maybe God wants to establish through the writer of Hebrews rest in God before we race for God. Hebrews 4 is all about a rest that we are invited into. And the weekly rhythm of that is Sabbath. So I just want to give you a framework in the next few minutes of how we can actually experience the rest. And it's going to be 4 words, but before we do that, just to let you know, we're going to do a course. I know, Practicing the Way, Sabbath course is launching, and you can sign up to be a part of this. We're doing it at all of our locations in different ways. You can find out how you can do this as part of your community group. I just want to get that out there right now to let you know that this is not enough time to unveil all the things that are Sabbath. But I want to give you a framework, and it's these 4 words from Pete Scazzaro, who wrote Emotionally Healthy Relationships. It's stop, rest, delight, and contemplate. Stop, rest, delight, and contemplate. So if you think about your framework for a Sabbath day, you're stopping, meaning you're putting your phone away. I have a box in my house, I put my phone in the box. You're resting, you're being present to reality. You're delighting, you have activities that stir your soul for worship for God, and you contemplate. You fix and focus your eyes on Jesus. The posture of your heart is to receive and reflect on him. So we're going to talk through each one of these. So the first one is stop. Look at your neighbor and say, stop. Stop. On the 7th day, God rested. God stopped. Therefore, we stop. Okay, let me take you back. February 2020. You remember it? Yep, Super Bowl Sunday. I don't know where you were at. Super Bowl Sunday for me, I was driving to Auburn, Alabama to interview for this job. And I show up Super Bowl Sunday, and I sit on the front row, and I remember we had just found out we were pregnant. My wife looks at me, and as we're walking into church, she's like, do not tell anyone that we are pregnant. I'm like, I feel like a kid with a secret. I'm like, oh no, I'm going to tell somebody, you know? And so we're walking to church. I sit in the front row, and sometimes when you come to our church, it feels like Miles is talking directly to you, like through the camera, or he's making eye contact with you. That day, I know he was talking to me, because he said, I got a one-off sermon. It's called Bold as a Lion, and some of you need to be bold as a lion and move to Auburn, Alabama. He looked at me in the front row. And I remember that day, I sat next to who's now one of our elders, Will Herring. And I didn't know him at the time, and I sit down, and I meet him, and he's like, hey, what are you doing here? And he's like, I'm like, oh, I'm interviewing for the college pastor position. He's like, do you have any kids? I literally remember thinking to myself, I'm not sure. Hey man, I'm the college pastor. I'm not sure if I have any kids out there, but, and I remember I told him, I look at Will, and I'm like, we're pregnant, you know? And he still holds that over Miles' head to this day. But I remember that day, all the excitement, all the energy. February 2020, less than a few weeks later, a massive pandemic hit. The world shut down. I didn't know if I had a job. I had to call Miles to affirm that. And it was a horrible time. So much panic, pain, loss. It was horrific. And yet, if I were to ask some of you, not all of you, some of you, the week before the pandemic hit, you were overwhelmed, you were anxious, you were stressed, You were panicking about your future. You were in a really dark place. And then the world screeched to a halt. And for some of you, it was actually a saving grace. You know how I know that? You did a puzzle. You did a board game with your friends and family. You took one of those Zoom meetings. You know what I'm talking about? With the pajama pants, but then the button down up top and thought no one noticed. Like, it was such a strange time. And yet, I think most of America realized there is an ache in our souls to stop. I think it's why, by the way, God has one spiritual discipline in the 10 Commandments, and it's Sabbath. Read this in Exodus 20, verse 8. It says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And after Moses breaks the first set of tablets, he rewrites them in the second set in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and it says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So in our house, we light 2 candles. Why? Observe the Sabbath day. God rested, so therefore we will rest. Even if everything's anxious, even if it's hard, we will rest. And then also, we will remember that we are no longer a slave. You might be like, man, that's a big jump from Pharaoh to America. Okay, what is our screens on our phones doing to us? Okay, what are our schedules that are so dictated around the world that we say we left behind? You know, it's very interesting that when you have the rhythm to remember and observe the Sabbath, it gives you the opportunity to allow your life to be driven by your worship and not your work. And so we will stop as a church. And then number 2, we will rest. We will rest. This means being present to actual life. It means potentially turning off your phone. It means completely resting. And I'll give you more about what that means in just a moment. But let's go back to Hebrews. Verse 6, it says, therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. What's happening? He repeats the verse again. Still, it remains an opportunity for you to enter into that rest as long as today is called today. And remember that disobedience is why Israelites did not enter into the promised land. But pay attention to verse 8. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. What does he mean by that? So the Hebrews would know about Joshua. And what he's saying is that even though Canaan, the promised land, represented rest, when Joshua entered into the promised land, there was still unrest in his spirit. He still was not fully at rest. Now, if I could nerd out on you guys for a second and just stay with me for a moment. Okay, there are 2 words in Greek for rest. One is anapausis and one is katapausis. I know, really cool. It's like pause, is where we get the word pause from. Anapausis is like an up pause. So think about when Jesus says, come to me all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest for your souls. He's saying if you're discouraged, if you're down, if you're depleted, I will give you an up rest for your souls. In Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 4, or in chapter 4, all he says is katapausis, 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 which means you will receive a down rest into your souls. And so when he's talking about this rest, he's continually using that word, katapausis, katapausis. And then read verse 9. It says, there remains then should be katapausis, but instead a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Okay, look at me. This is why I'm freaking out about this all week. Because at the beginning of chapter 4, where he says, therefore, it means the writer's about to make a point to everybody listening. And he uses the phrase katapausis for rest in verse 1, in verse 3, in verse 3, in verse 5, in verse 6, and in verse 8, 6 times. And then he's supposed to say, there remains then a katapausis. But instead, he makes up a brand new word. The only time this is used in the Bible. He says, there remains then a Sabbath rest on the 7th one. a Sabbath rest for God's people. And for us, it's like, okay, that's cool. But for a Jewish mind or a Hebrew believer, as they're reading this, it would be clicking in their mind that there is a new rest that is available. In fact, the rest that Joshua and all of Israel longed for is now available. Why? Because there's a better Joshua who has shown up. Yeshua, Jesus Christ, is offering us a better rest. But it's not just a down pause. No, it's a heavenly peace attached to the final Sabbath. And if you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, just look at me for a second. What this means is that embedded into your weekly rhythm is an invitation to experience heaven. Because the Sabbath rest that we long for is a foretaste of heaven one day. And so for us, it's so easy to run and run and run and run. But what he's saying here is that everything that Israel longed for in the Messiah has come. And that other day that Joshua and all of them were waiting for is now today. Because your rest is attached to a person and not a place. And your rest is attached to heaven and not to earth. So you and I have an invitation to delight. That's number 3, delight. We're going to stop, we're going to rest, and then we're going to delight. We're going to delight. This is not a day off or a vacation day. It's not a self-centered mental health day. It's a day that we delight. The fact that we have a final rest awaiting us in heaven one day. And just look at me for a sec. When I was praying, sometimes I pray just throughout the room, and I felt very specific that I was supposed to say this out loud, that some of you, it's been a very long time since you enjoyed God. You've been working for God. You've been moralizing your life for God. You've been doing for God. You've been producing for God. And I just felt this week, I was like, Lord, what do you want me to say to your people through your word? And I just felt almost an uncanny sense. Tell them to enjoy me again. We're going to delight. And there's a phrase that we use for the era that we're in. It's called the already but not yet. It's the era of redemptive history we believe we're in. And so we believe that the Sabbath day is the one day of your week to experience the already. The other 6 are for the not yet. In fact, when Jesus shows up and says, repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near, you know what I think? I immediately jump to all the ways that heaven is not here. So I immediately jump to all the work we got to do and all the evangelizing we got to do and all the serving we got to do and all the things we got to do. But ultimately, Sabbath is meant to be that one day that you reserve for the already. I'm going to delight in heaven. This is a dress rehearsal, as I would call it, for heaven. Now, as the college pastor of this church, I have the privilege of officiating a lot of weddings, okay? And if you've been to a wedding weekend recently, you know there's the different phases throughout the time. So the first is the rehearsal. And if you know the rehearsal, you know it's this really intense moment where you're trying to wrangle the groomsmen. They're like cats, wandering off. And then you got the mother of the bride who somehow it's all about her in this moment. And I'm really confused. And then you have the bride who's like getting ready and is like barking orders. And the reason why is so that way on the wedding day, when they're doing the actual wedding, they can enjoy it. And so I look at the bride and the groom on the wedding day, and I'm like, hey, you represent Jesus. You represent the church. Enjoy today. Don't make it about all that other stuff. You already did that. So the rehearsal is this intense moment. But then, after the rehearsal, you have a rehearsal dinner. And when you have the rehearsal dinner, everyone there, your family, your friends, your closest people, and there's this big feast, and it's enjoying, and you're having this great time. And then each part of the bridal party or some of the family members will start to stand up. And what will they do? They start giving speeches. And they start giving words of blessing this couple into the future and blessing them in their marriage. And it's powerful. And I have a picture of one that I went to. And I love this picture because this is a couple who's receiving words from their family and their friends. But the one who's standing here is actually the father. If you missed anything that I've said so far about the Sabbath practice, I think the most important part of the Sabbath practice is the opening feast that you have with your family. And part of that feast for me is a fatherly blessing that I get to give my family. So when you open up and you have this meal and you have this feast together, I mean that you look your kids in the face. For me, I look Shepherd He was only 2 years old. And I just look at him and say, hey, you were named after David. A heart of David is something you have. You're bold, you're courageous. Look at Griffin. And I say, you were named after your grandfather who loved Jesus. You're a leader. You're my firstborn son. I'm so proud of you. I look at my wife and I say, hey, look, I'm so glad that you married me. I don't know why you chose me, but here we are. And I cannot believe it's been 7 years that we've been married. And then you have this feast. And I just had this thought as I was thinking about our church and our families, that Sabbath is not just a day for you to feel better. Sabbath is not just a day for you to make sure that God commands it, so yes, we will obey it. Sabbath is a day for us that we could actually change the next generation. Think about if you grew up with your father looking you in the eyes and giving you identity and purpose and blessing and Bible verses. Think about the next generation of our kids that would raise up thinking that this is all normal. Think about the fact that when they leave my house, thinking about my boys, I don't want them to be tempted by the world and what the world has to offer because they experienced heaven in my home. This is so much more than just a day off. This is your invitation into generational change for your family. To not get sucked into the workaholism that so many of us felt trapped to in the previous generations. You might be like, it's too late. It's never too late. It's never too late. So we're going to stop. We're going to rest. We're going to delight. And we're going to contemplate. Contemplate. I just wrote in my notes this week, man, I want my boys to know me for my delight and not my discipline. And I think a lot of times we know God for his discipline, but we don't know his delight. Psalm 16, one of my favorite verses, talks about the path in front of us, that he has joy in his presence, eternal pleasures at his right hand. So we're going to contemplate the glory of God. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, and we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. If you remember, this was our word for the year as a church. And if you came to that sermon, the title was Commissioned by Glory. And immediately you think about the missionaries and you think about elders and you think about pastors. But imagine if there was a weekly rhythm in your life to be commissioned by glory into the week. What if the cultural narrative that says live for the weekend was flipped and now we live from the weekend? What if we have an invitation in front of us into the deep, ordinary life that is ours? John Mark Comer, who does a lot of the Sabbath work that I've been following and teaching, he says it this way. He says, Sabbath is a time to drink deeply from the well of ordinary life. To drink deeply from the well of ordinary life. You know God transforms you in your ordinary life. We think that he's going to transform us over here on the mountaintop or once we get away. In fact, I would say most of us are trying to use vacations as our source of rest. You know what a vacation is? It means you vacate your life. If your rest is only coming from vacating your life, it means you could end up with an empty life. So your rest comes from God to live into the weekend. And if you're wondering, how do I build a Sabbath day? Well, good news is we actually have a card that we're going to give you on your way out. I'm being dead serious. And on this card, there's an instruction. If you're like, just tell me what to do starting on the first day, tell me what to do during the day, we have an instruction for you. Again, we have a Sabbath course that's being set up. We want you to drink deeply of the ordinary life. So all of your activities for that day, think about this grid. How do I draw near to the presence of God? You know, for some, it might mean cutting the grass. Some of you enjoy cutting the grass. Y'all are crazy. Andy Lysovitz, who's one of our elders, always tells me, he said, I think the gates to hell are an entrance to Lowe's. And I was like, yeah, that's how I feel too. Some of you, cutting the grass is the best thing you can do to enjoy the presence of God. All I'm saying is that as you think through your rhythms, yesterday for me with my family and our Sabbath day, it meant going to Waffle House, doing a bunch of Legos with my boys. It meant going on some walks. It meant reading a book. It meant fully disconnecting so I could be even ready to preach to you guys today. So what does that look like for you? I don't know, but God talks about how the refreshing is needed for us in Sabbath. So Exodus 31:17 says, it will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. That word is so important. It means God, quite literally in Hebrew, caught his breath. It means God catches his breath. And I got to be honest, again, I thought I was cool, and then in my 20s, I got asthma. okay? And it's really hard to look tough at a basketball game when you're like, all right, guys, let's go. And then you like run out on the court, right? Like, but that inhaler that I have now is so important before the activity. It doesn't really help you halfway down. So you have to take the inhaler and then go on the run. And so the point I'm trying to make is that some of you need to drink deeply, meaning inhale the presence of God before you run into your week. You have to be refreshed. And a lot of you, it's been a long time since you caught your breath. So let's finish with this verse. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. And before we close, I just want to give you two people that I believe show us a kind of case study as to why, if you're sitting here and you're thinking, yeah, but my life, yeah, but my job, yeah, but my season, yeah, but okay, I get it. I'm just asking you to give God space to be God. That's all I'm asking. But one of those is Jesus. If you're like, man, I just got such a heavy call in my life right now, I don't know if I have time to stop and Sabbath. Okay, well, Jesus showed up and immediately lived a life where he was experiencing Sabbath. And then he goes into the wilderness after receiving identity from his Father, and he's tempted for 40 days by the devil, comes out, and this is what it says about him in Luke chapter 4. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. When Jesus began his ministry, he did not leave his rhythm of rest. Think about it. God rested when he made the earth, and then God rested when he was on earth. And it didn't just stop when he started his ministry. No, it continued through his entire life. And if you're like, man, that's the Son of God, great. I'm not the Son of God. I get that. Think about Mary Magdalene. If you don't know Mary's story, we sang about her actually just a little bit ago with go into the altar. That's all about her breaking the jar of alabaster, just a perfume at Jesus' feet. She's the one who demons were cast out of. She was the one who was at Jesus' feet when Martha was doing the dishes. She's the one who loves Jesus, was at the crucifixion, and on the crucifixion on a Friday, experiences the most pain and heartbreak of anyone. And then it says this about her in John 20. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. Why does that matter? The first day of the Jewish week is Sunday, which means Saturday is the Sabbath. It means she observed the Sabbath even after she watched her best friend go into the grave. Even while she was experiencing unredeemable pain and heartbreak, she still observed the Sabbath. And the whole purpose I'm trying to make, or the point I'm trying to make, is that sometimes in your life, you will experience that kind of pain. You will experience that kind of heartache. You will experience that death. And what you'll feel is the crucifixion, the weight of the crucifixion. But maybe her observing the Sabbath was not about her getting over the crucifixion, but was God preparing her for the resurrection. Maybe she just knew. I don't know what you're doing, God, but I will obey. I don't understand, God, but I will obey your voice. And I will observe the Sabbath because that's what I know you've asked me to do. Sometimes the Sabbath and obeying God is more important than the urgency of the task that we feel. And so I just want to push before you again, just what does it look like in your space to allow God to be God? And I know I was joking about Chick-fil-A earlier, but like seriously, you know they just passed McDonald's as the most revenue per store of any company, and they did it in 6 days instead of 7? I almost clapped when I found that out. I don't know why. I felt attached to them. But the whole purpose is they did the one thing that everyone in their industry said, this is the dumbest thing you can do. Take off a weekend in this industry? No way. You could never survive. And here they are. And all I'm saying is that's an example of what God could possibly be wanting to do in your life. So let me just close with a story. You can put your notes away. But I just want everyone's focus and attention, if possible. And so I ended up getting hired, if you couldn't tell. I got hired as the college and community pastor, and then COVID shut the world down. So there was no college students around, and there was definitely no community happening for the first 6 months of my job. So what was asked of me was they gave me a list of all the different people in our church that are kind of leaders and volunteers and serving. And they said, just start calling these people. And so I called this one guy, and it's kind of weird to ask a grown man to go on a walk, but that's what I did. And I was like, hey, do you want to go on a walk on our trail outside my house? And he said, sure. He's like, I'm actually training a puppy, so this is great. And I was like, why'd you buy a puppy in the pandemic? It seems dumb. And he's like, don't ask me, it was my wife, the whole thing. And so he shows up, and he jumps out of his truck, and the little brown lab puppy jumps out with him. And he's walking next to this brown lab, and we start walking on this trail, and he has this massive stick, and he's like waving the stick right next to him. And I watch as the little puppy dog is kind of behind the stick, and every now and then we get a little overstimulated and try to run in front to go smell something or whatever, and it would be like the smallest little bonk on the head, and the puppy would just slowly step back. And so I'm walking, halfway down, and I'm just like, okay, help me understand what's happening here. Help me understand. I know you're training him, but tell me more. And he said, this dog will pull me for the rest of his life if I don't teach him now to walk at my pace. I was like, that's a great sermon illustration. I'm stealing that one day for sure. But as he's saying this, I'm like, that's really cool. Walk at the pace of God. It's so cool. He said, no, you don't understand. It's not just about the pace of him. He said, because if I can teach this dog to walk at my pace, then he will learn how to obey my voice. See, it's not actually about the pace. It's actually about the voice. And he will continue to pull me into the life that he wants to live, and the smells and things and all of that, and he will never learn to hear my voice. And I thought, man, what an example of how so many of us are living our lives chasing after Jesus. We're yanking Jesus into our future. Here are my dreams. Here are my goals. Here are my aspirations. Here's all that I want to accomplish. Come on, Jesus. Come on, come with me. I'm telling you, this is what's going to be best for me. I'm telling you, this is what I need for my life. I'm telling you, this is the way we should go. And then he's like, the rod and the staff that just bonks you on the head. And it's like, no. Because at the same time of you trying to pull Jesus into your life, you're mad at him because you can't hear his voice. You're frustrated that he's not speaking to you. What if Sabbath is, metaphorically speaking, that consistent reminder, I will walk at your pace. But not just for that. I will walk at your pace because I want to obey your voice. I want to learn your voice. And I want to be postured in a position to hear you. See, the goal of Sabbath is not to do the Sabbath. The goal of Sabbath is intimacy. The power and the presence of God is available to you and I. And we can experience heaven now. So we'll never settle for the world again. So you can go ahead and take out your communion sets. We're going to remember the body and the blood of Jesus just as an opportunity for us to once again remember what he has done on our behalf. He has purchased for us the other day that Joshua longed for. And so if you didn't get one, just raise your hand. And again, I'm going to challenge all the husbands to pray over your wives. This is something that the body of Christ does, believers. So if you're not a believer in Jesus, just throw it underneath your seat. But this is also an opportunity. If you want to say yes to Jesus and enter into his rest, do that now. But just one final closing thought. We take communion, and it's a guaranteed place of encounter, but we take communion because one day we won't. One day we will have a feast in the presence of Jesus, and we will look him in the face, and the glow and the radiance of his love will shower onto us. And so as you take communion today, I want to challenge you, let's enter into the rest of God that he purchased on the cross. And let's enjoy the fact that one day we will never partake again because we'll be with him. So you guys are blessed to take communion. Let me just pray over it. Father, I pray a blessing over this time. I pray that so many of us who've been anxious and running, God, we would enjoy you again. Help us to be here present in the moment. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.